Hello, good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad KUTTAN.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider the news of the day. Let's begin with news that the Sarawak State Government will be setting up a committee to monitor the teaching of science and mathematics in English for primary 1 classes in the state next year. They're going to give it about 6 months to a year for the committee to monitor the move. In any case, Sarawak will be the first state in Malaysia to teach maths and science in English.
Right, and because what's really interesting is that they're saying that the issue here really is that there are many teachers who are used to delivering maths and science in Malay and Bahasa Malaysia, and so the question is whether they'll be able to do it in English. And I think they're bringing together experts and professionals to do this monitoring. So it's actually, I think, an effort seen as being kind of targeted at whether this policy will actually work and be effective.
Okay. Well, you know, I guess my concern is what makes Sarawak think that they can effectively implement this project or this move when in the past we've seen several failed attempts. I mean, 2003, Teaching and Learning of Science and Mathematics in English, PPSMI, if you remember, that was then scrapped in 2009 when studies revealed that students were just not learning because they didn't have the proficiency of the language. And then in 2016, we had the dual language program that allowed selected primary and secondary schools to teach science and maths in English. But that, I think that's only selected schools. But this is a blanket-wide, I guess, option for schools.
Right. I mean, what is interesting is I think Sarawak has, since I think the last general elections, been very vocal about the question of English being essential as a skill for young Sarawakians to excel in the world and in today's world. And so, and they've pushed back on the kind of nationalist rhetoric that is so often, bedevils the discussion about the kind of linguistic skills that students ought to have in order to be future ready, to be employable. All these questions are bedeviled by the kind of nationalist rhetoric of saying we need to protect the national language against any kind of rivals.
Yeah, so I mean the criticisms that we saw come out from PPSMI and the dual language program had backlash that it was eroding nationalism, it was eroding the mastery of the national language. But I think Sarawak doesn't have the same kind of hang-up perhaps that the rest of Malaysia might have.
Well, it's a hang-up, I think, that not so much the rest of Malaysia, but some cultural nationalists have and have imposed their views, and politicians are often very scared of them. And so, they tend not to want to make the counter-argument. Now, I think it also is an opportune time for us to discuss whether delivering language skills through maths and science lessons is the way to go. I mean, pedagogically, is it even sound to force kids to learn English not through increased English classes, not through English literature, which is the way that I think most sensible people will do. They're doing it through maths and science.
Right.
It's a curious route in order to promote the English language and help the mastery of that language.
Well, we'll have to see in 6 to 12 months whether this will pan out for the state of Sarawak. But still on this education theme, but more towards tertiary education, we have DAP Secretary General Lim Guan Eng saying that the Pakatan Harapan government wants a complete break with the past practice of providing funding for private education institution, which depends on its management's political ties. Now, he's saying that Putrajaya will provide at least 30 million ringgit in funding for Tunku Abdul Rahman University College only if MCA relinquishes control of this situation. Now, is this a step in the right direction for institutional reforms?
Well, again, Melissa, we often faced a situation where in the changes that happen, managing the way in which a government policy is received is very important. Now, this move might be seen as an attempt to basically to undermine a political rival, a rival that's lost recently the elections, which is MCA, and to promote your own political agenda. But and that might actually, in some ways, not be the purpose. The purpose might be to de-link educational institutions from political ones, which is something that kind of happened over the years during the Barisan Nasional decades of rule.
Are you concerned about the optics that perhaps the Pakatan Harapan government might look vindictive if they go ahead with this move?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one is the optics, and the other, of course, is the fate of young people, right? So if this becomes a standoff between the Pakatan Harapan government and the MCA, and the MCA refuses to relinquish control over Tunku Abdul Rahman University College, what will happen to the students? I mean, the students, will they be collateral in this tussle between political forces? And I think that's something I'm concerned about. We should never sacrifice the fate of young people because of the kind of politics of the day.
I'm just curious about the difference when it comes to the approach for politically linked educational institutions versus, say, politically linked media outlets, for instance. Is the government going to insist on, the management of media or the stakeholders of media organizations pull back?
Well, it's very interesting because political parties have long been involved in business, and this might be a structural problem that will take time to unravel, right? I mean, political parties earn a revenue through their business interests. They have companies they're holding companies that basically invest in various things, including the media. So Warren owns staff, for instance.
But I think the difference is that perhaps because this educational institution is asking for funding, right? Whereas, media organizations may not be dependent on funding from the federal government. Anyway, let's turn our attention now to the Tanjung PI by-election. Opposition lawmakers are considering a legal challenge against the Election Commission's new ruling that political campaigners are required to obtain police permits for their walkabouts, and this includes door-to-door visits. So the latest on this is that the EC has responded.
And Melissa, they've responded by saying that actually this is not something that they have imposed, but that the police force has imposed. So PDRM, Police Diraja Malaysia, they're the ones that have set up this new laws. And the question, of course, is, regardless of where it comes from, are these new rulings going to stymie the democratic culture? Are they going to increase bureaucratization? Are they going to create a situation where candidates have less access to voters rather than enable access to voters, which is, I guess, the kind of democratic game plan that we want. We want a democratic and electoral system that improves access, that does kind of a leveling of the playing field.
Well, that is the EC's job, right? But in the response that the EC had just put out not too long ago, it says that the institution tasked to keep law and order is not the SPR, not the Election Commission, but rather it is the police. Now, it's not within the jurisdiction of the EC to issue permits or to impose requirements for permits. It is the police's jurisdiction and power. Now, in the case of Tanjung PI, the police has decided to impose a new requirement for permits, even for walkabouts and house-to-house visits. And the question is, why now? Why the change now? Why is this a new requirement? Yeah,
and when you look at the reports, one of the things that have said, concerns around the dissemination of hate speech or banners that might increase tensions on a local level.
Misinformation, disinformation.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can understand why regulators might want to have some control of the situation, not have it a free-for-all. But at the same time, is the requirement to have a permit for a walkabout reasonable? I mean,
does a walkabout seem to be just almost a normal part of campaigning? Like just
it is.
around?
I mean, pressing flesh, as they call it, is in fact a fairly standard kind of democratic procedure. The question is, if the ability to get a permit requires nothing much than a kind of a signing of a form, then perhaps it doesn't really matter. But again, it's the issue is whether we're creating bureaucratic hurdles between candidates and voters, unnecessary laws that in fact kind of undermine the democratic. nature of the electoral game. Yeah.
Okay, after this, we're going to take a closer look at the SRC trial of Datuk Sri Najib Razak. Make sure to stay tuned to consider this. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you. Now, after hearing from 57 witnesses and evaluating 750 exhibits, the High Court yesterday ordered former Prime Minister Datuk Seri Najib Razak to enter his defence for 7 charges in the SRC International trial. This involving the misappropriation of some 42 million ringgit in SRC funds. Now, joining us on the line to help us to shed more light on the current situation, we have Lim Wei Jet, dispute resolution lawyer. Thank you so much for joining us, Wei Jet. Good evening. Now,
good evening, Shah.
Was this court's decision surprising?
Personally, no, but I can't comment further because I didn't participate in the trial, nor have I seen all the evidence. But Najib seems to have taken this in good stride from his social media post. He seems willing to enter the fray and to tell the nation his part of the story. So if Najib is excited, so should we.
Okay, help us understand some of the kind of reports that have come out with it. I mean, we had reports saying that the judge, Justice Mohammad Nazlan, had opined that the strategic investment vehicle was designed to be used for Najib's personal advantage. Now, when judges speak in this way, when they say that they can infer from evidence or they can construe that that there was a criminal element in the way things were done, Najib's failure, as it were, to avoid conflict of interest, is the judge already in the mind that Najib is guilty?
Not at this stage. So what has happened at this stage is that the judge has found that a prima facie case has been established. Now, prima facie means on the face of it. In the legal context, it means that the prosecution has adduced enough evidence to amount to a conviction, if not rebutted or traversed by the defense. So it is now the duty on the defense to rebut and to traverse the evidence of the prosecution to create a reasonable doubt so that there will be no conviction. So there is no conclusive finding by the judge at this point in time, but the judge has found, at the very least, that elements of the charges against Datuk Seri Najib Razak have been established by the prosecution, and it is now up to the defense to poke holes and attack the prosecution's case.
Wei Jet, I mean, for many of us who are not familiar with the, I guess, criminal trial process, could we zoom out a little bit and can you help walk us through the different stages of a criminal trial process and where we're at currently?
Sure. At the beginning of the trial, of course, the charges are being read to the accused. And if the accused pleads not guilty, then we enter into the first stage of the criminal trial process, which is the prosecution's case. So the prosecution will call prosecution witnesses, will adduce prosecution evidence. The accuser's lawyer will be able to cross-examine the prosecution's witness and evidence. At the end of that, the judge has to decide whether a prima facie case has been established. If there is no prima facie case, then the defense is acquitted, and the accused is acquitted. If there is a prima facie case, then we enter into the second stage of the criminal trial process, whereby the accused is invited to enter his defense. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the accused can appear himself as a witness. He can call as many number of witnesses as he wants to. The goal of the accused at this stage is to paint a reasonable doubt in the prosecution's case. At the end of that, if the judge believes that there is reasonable doubt to the prosecution's case, then the accused is acquitted. If the judge finds that the prosecution's case has been established beyond reasonable doubt, then a conviction is secured, the person is found guilty, and a sentence will be meted out accordingly. That in gist is the criminal trial process. Okay. So where we are today is the first stage has been completed, a prima facie case has been established. Now we enter into the second stage where the defense is allowed to adduce evidence and witnesses.
Wait, what about this option that was given to Datuk Seri Najib Razak when he was said that he could remain silent, he could issue a statement, there were 2 types of statements that he could have made. Help us understand what are the legal issues behind it. Why wouldn't he remain silent?
All right, so at the defense stage, there are 3 options available to the accused. Number 1, as you mentioned earlier, Sharaad, the accused can remain silent. But he shouldn't remain silent because the very definition of a prima facie finding is that the prosecution has already established its case which would warrant a conviction, and it is now on the accused to rebut that prosecution's case. So if he remains silent, inevitably he has to end up with the punishment. The second option is if he gives an unsworn statement from the dock. This means that the accused goes to the witness box, gives a statement, but he is not subjected to cross-examination. Now, if you recall, this was what Anwar Ibrahim did in the Sodomy 2 trial. Of course, in this sort of unsworn statement, the probative value of that unsworn statement is very low. The reason is simple, because that evidence is not tested and subjected to the rigors of cross-examination. The third and most common option is for the accused to give a sworn statement from the dock, which means that he goes to the witness box, he gives his statement, and he is subjected to cross-examination. The value of that evidence is no doubt higher than an unsworn statement. So those are the three options that are available by Najib Razak. At this stage, he has chosen to opt for the third option, which is to give a sworn statement from the dock.
Right. Just now you mentioned that this is the second stage, right? So the first stage of the SRC's trial, Najib's SRC's trial has stretched for about 60 days now. I think it was April 3rd all the way till October 23rd. Now, is that common, this kind of time frame? How long do you expect trials like these to last, especially since now we're embarking on that second stage?
Yeah, it really depends. It depends on the number of witnesses that will be called. It depends on the number of episodes of conjunctivitis that will happen. It depends on the number of by-elections which Najib is required to attend to. All this is in the discretion of the judge. But we have to understand that in a case as complicated as this, where complex financial transactions are involved, we have to be patient. We have to allow the due process to take its course. Because we are a nation of civilized people, and the international community expects the rule of law to be abided by. So as much as certain quarters want Najib to be convicted as soon as possible, we have to follow the due process as required under the law.
Now, in anticipating what the defense might say, I mean, there are some things in the reports that have come out that suggest that the judge has already suggested that the Saudi royalty gift argument he found beyond comprehension. And also he noted that that impropriety was already proven regarding the flow of money from Gadingan Mentari to Ishan Perdana and then into Najib's account. Now, does that mean these areas are not going to be covered by the defense? I mean, what are the likely strategies left for the defense in this case?
Well, what the judge meant at this stage is that the prosecution has established all the elements of the charges. So it is now for Najib to rebut those findings, those preliminary findings, if I may, that the judge has made. So he hasn't made a conclusive finding per se in that respect. And he still has, the accused still has the opportunity to rebut and to address those kind of issues. And the accused can adopt an array of strategies. And I think one of the strategies that Najib Razak has opted is that he was totally not involved in all of these transactions. It was a grand design by Joe Low, and he was being led on. So there are several options that is available to him still. And it will be interesting to see what kind of angle that his legal team will pitch in the defense.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight, Weja, and for shedding light onto the criminal trial process. Now, we'll be back with more on Consider This, but before we go for a break, here's a quick video of what is next for Najib in the SRC trial. Welcome back to Consider This. Melisa and Sharaad here with you, and here's what we want you to consider tonight. Let's talk about the okay boomer phrase that's gone viral. Now, of course, boomer, as many of you know, is shorthand for a baby boomer, someone born between 1946 and 1964. Now, in internet parlance, okay boomer is a derogatory phrase used primarily by the younger generation to show their indignation or dismissal towards older people who seem indifferent to their concerns. Now, critics say that this phrase is ageist. Where do you stand, Sharaad, and are you a boomer?
Well, Melissa, let me put it this way. Though I'm born in 1966 and I don't quite make that cutoff point that
you're Gen X.
I am Gen X, I guess.
Yes.
But these categories are really derived from a very different context, the American context. And the idea was the post-war generation benefited from free education, for a booming economy that went up right out to the kind of mid-70s and before we had the oil crisis. And so this was a generation that had good jobs, stability. There was no such thing as the gig economy. They were able to buy property, and they really secured a life for them. Now, when they speak about their life experiences, Melissa, they speak to a generation where the gig economy is supplying most of the jobs. There's a lot of insecurity, never mind the ecological crisis. And so boomers seem not to have the kind of moral standpoint when they give advice to the snowflake generation.
Well, you know, I think it goes both ways, and I have to say that in this kind of argument, I don't think this, okay boomer, which is a very simple yet very biting retort, is a good way to respond. And I understand where you're coming from. The generational differences, this is the boomer generation is a generation that grew up, that raised with a children were meant to be seen, not heard mentality. And the Gen X's or Gen Z's were raised, always switched on, always plugged in generation. So there is this, I guess, a very different mentality. And when you brought up the economy, the climate crisis, there's also a lot of things that are changing that these generations are grappling with, The Me Too movement, for instance, can be quite difficult for the boomer generation to deal with. The PC culture, this woke culture that's happening at the moment. And, even things like referring to people by their preferred pronouns, all these different things, the baby boomers may not understand the differences or the nuances when it comes to Gen Zs.
Yeah, I take all the criticism of boomers seriously. I think millennials, but this is something that all generations, there's always going to be intergenerational conflict. They're changing norms and so on and so forth, right? And it's probably accelerated in the 20th century that each generation seems to have, perhaps because of the mass media, a different sense of itself and of the world. I must say that I think the boomer generation and my generation was brought up on parenting outlooks are very different, that aren't in fact kind of patriarchal and that silence young people. I
children are seen, not heard mentality.
I don't think that's I think even that's an older generation.
Well, they were raised by their parents who thought that way, and therefore raised their children thinking that too.
Right, but the advantage of my generation or the generation just before me, my mother's generation was Dr. Spock, and a very different sense. Dr. Spock being a child psychologist in America that changed the way parents thought of themselves and their children. There's much more sensitivity, but okay. Admittedly, this way of dismissing each other.
Yeah, I don't like that at all.
Snowflake on one hand or okay boomer on the other. And I think neither of them fosters dialogue.
Correct. It's very easy that, once you start resorting to the okay boomer retort, it's very easy to just dismiss. And actually doing the same thing that you're accusing the boomers of, right? By dismissing concerns.
Yeah. So you're not exactly the generation in question, right?
I'm a millennial, I would say.
You're a millennial, okay.
Exennial, I don't know what that is.
Whatever our position, learning to have a conversation, and I think the issue is the forum for it, right? So many of us are now using platforms that don't foster dialogue, that in fact, that foster these quick retorts. And so, if you're Twitter and you have 100 and whatever 40 characters, you could likely to be very dismissive very quickly.
Well, I saw something on Twitter tweeted by Tharma Pillai, who's with the Undi 18 movement, and he said, instead of saying, okay, boomer, maybe you can ask, are you okay, boomer? Which I think is a lot sweeter and more open to fostering dialogue. That's all the time we have tonight. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with another episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris with Sharaad KUTTAN signing off. Thank you for watching and good night.